Antarctica is like the jewel in the crown, really. It's another world. Once you've done Antarctica, unfortunately, everything else seems a little bit dull. My wife was against me going, and I said to her, well, I'll probably live to tell the tale. And it turns out I did, and it's quite a tale.
It's the tale of more than 200 people who embarked on an Antarctic cruise during a pandemic. At a cost of around $20,000, Australian company Aurora Expeditions was offering passengers a taste of adventure. But for some, it would end in tragedy.
March 23, 3 patients with fever. March 24, 5 patients with fever.
More than half of them got COVID-19.
We said we have to do something. These people cannot stay in that boat for longer.
For one person, the trip would be fatal.
They got a wheelchair and popped her in the wheelchair, and that's the last I saw of her.
Melbourne's second wave lockdown prevents me from travelling overseas for Dateline.
No, you can't have my phone. All right, take my phone. Take my phone.
Cooped up at home instead, I've been puzzling over the saga of the ship named after Australian mountaineer Greg Mortimer.
Buenos dias, Dr. Rando.
Buenos dias. Hello, how are you?
The Greg Mortimer was like a microcosm of the pandemic, where everyone experiences the same events differently.
Hi.
We're having
a
wonderful day out in
the Antarctica.
For some, the virus threatened their vacation. For others, their livelihood, or even their life. Our story begins on the 15th of March in Ushuaia, on the southern tip of Latin America. 4 days after the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic. The plan was to set off that afternoon, crossing the Drake Passage to the Antarctic Peninsula, then to South Georgia, the Falklands, and back to Argentina.
For me, was a completely surprise in the moment that the new group of passengers came on board. My name is Mauricio Usme. I'm the emergency medical doctor in Medellin, Colombia, and also I was the medical officer on board of the Greg Mortimer ship. March 11, the World Health Organization gave the alert about the pandemic condition regarding the coronavirus. That's mean for us that we are under risk with the new embarkation. The new passengers, maybe someone is sick, and these people will bring the virus on board for us.
Empezamos un crucero que no debió hacerse nunca, porque ya estaba todo encendido.
Angela Gavilan is also Colombian, but lives in Chile. She's worked on cruise ships for more than 14 years as a maid.
Otras compañías ya habían parado sus operaciones. Mi esposo también trabaja en cruceros. Ellos pararon antes, empezaron a hacer cuarentena mucho antes de la alerta mundial. No hubo ni un solo caso de coronavirus a bordo de su barco y todos se fueron muy felices a sus casas, mientras nosotros empezamos una odisea el 15 de marzo.
While many crew members were afraid of the trip going ahead, some of the passengers were afraid it wouldn't.
I'm Anthony Phillip. I live in Sydney. I used to fly for 20 years as a long-haul flight attendant, and I've travelled to over 170 countries and territories.
So how are you feeling about the decision to embark on another international holiday when coronavirus was obviously affecting some parts of the world?
Not unconcerned and not unaware, but not believing that there was any inherent danger about what I was about to embark on. On the 15th of March, we had a pre-trip briefing hosted by the managing director of Aurora Expeditions. And he assured us that it was without doubt the safest place on the planet to be. There was no corona whatsoever.
I would have been disappointed had it not gone ahead, because I had been anticipating this life dream for some time and really looking forward to it.
Graham Paget is a retired surgeon from Denmark, West Australia, who had a lifelong dream of walking with penguins. He booked a cabin on the Greg Mortimer with his wife, Rose, who was also celebrating her 75th birthday.
There were several in our party who were very concerned that the trip was going ahead, and they had expressed these misgivings to the management of the trip, but they were told that it was going to go ahead, and if they chose to pull out, then there would be no refund or recourse.
The Greg Mortimer was the last cruise ship to leave Ushuaia.
I remember being overwhelmed with excitement. I was pinching myself. It was just truly such a remarkable experience to be pushing back from the port of Ushuaia, embarking on this trip that I had hoped to accomplish many, many years ago, and now it was actually happening.
Tell me about the first night.
Yes, we had a party for Rose because it was her birthday, and also from one of the other guys from Denmark. So it was a joint birthday party and good celebration.
How does it feel looking back on that now?
To be honest, I can't remember much about it. The events that followed on from that have just shadowed over it, I'm afraid, for me.
The first sign that the Greg Mortimer might be in trouble came just hours after it set off, when Argentina's president made a live televised address.
Así hemos tomado la decisión de que durante los próximos 15 días vamos a cerrar las fronteras y nadie podrá ingresar a la Argentina.
Their route back was now blocked.
It was almost like the trap was already sprung. This was already my feeling of, oh dear, you know, this could not go well. My name's Jeff Green. I live in New Zealand, and I was the expedition doctor on the Greg Mortimer. It clearly was that we're going to have to find a plan B straight away. So we were going to do a trip to the peninsula, and then we were going to fly out from the Falklands back home.
It was a few more days before passengers were told of the plan to cut the trip short and leave from the Falklands. They felt that everything possible was being done to ensure their safety.
There were sanitising stations everywhere to clean your hands. They kept reminding us that this was necessary. Before going in to eat in the dining room, they literally had a staff member watch us wash our hands with soap and water. There were staff perpetually cleaning banisters, handrails, all the kind of touch points that one would expect. It was a very proactive approach to trying to stop something before it started.
Siempre sentía de esa incertidumbre, hacer mi trabajo rápido, protegerme lo más que pudiera y siempre pensar de espero que no tenga nadie el virus, espero que mis pasajeros estén sanos.
Many of the crew were frightened of the passengers, who they regarded as a source of possible infection.
Siempre estuvo ese miedo de... Es como una intuición, cuando tienes una intuición de que no quieres ver algo, pero está ahí.
On the 18th, we arrived early morning to be surrounded by glaciers and icebergs, and it was just absolutely, it was gobsmackingly beautiful. It was so pristine. The colour of the light, I sound really like whacked, but it was like nothing else I'd ever seen. Everybody was running around, clicking away, whether it was an iPhone or a big SLR. They were videoing, everybody was oohing and ahhing.
We could just see these wonderful animals doing their thing in spite of us. They weren't perturbed by us at all. It was just beautiful. One of my pictures is of a seal that was swimming just alongside the Zodiac. He popped up and looked at me, and I've got a close-up shot of him sort of saying, "Hello, who are you?"
You're seeing things that are just gobsmacking. So the mood was great. It was always that feeling that we were the lucky ones. Everyone we knew back on planet Earth was going into an increasingly meltdown situation. But at that moment, we felt that we were in this great little bubble of purity.
What happened to change all that?
I already started noticing more people coughing and sneezing in the talks, and I was already, what if, you know. So I repeated my hygiene talk, but then on the afternoon of that day, one of the passengers came up to me and said, "I'd like you to come and see my wife, or my partner. She's got a fever." It was, you know, it was high enough to be significant. So I immediately went and told Maurizio, who was the ship's doctor and actually had the sort of legal, medical responsibility for the whole boat. And we went together. This was like, oh, so close. I mean, I must admit what went through my mind was, and so it starts.
Jeff called me about one passenger reporting maybe fever. The protocol was very clear. We need to put under isolation all the ship until we can to rule out if we have or not COVID-19.
We were informed in the morning that we were required to stay inside our cabins. There was no talk that it was COVID. It was just somebody had shown a higher temperature reading. But they said to take necessary precautions. We're going to keep you all apart from each other, and all services, meals would be delivered to us.
Así que estos días se incrementó mucho el trabajo, se incrementó obviamente la presión y también la preocupación, porque ya esto ya no estaba, era un crucero de vacaciones, ya todos los pasajeros estaban encerrados y nosotros estábamos cuidando de ellos.
We would go into full PPE, and Maurizio and I would then go and we'd divided up the different decks and we would work our way through and we'd record all of the temperatures, obviously looking for anyone spiking other fevers. We had a couple of days where really it just seemed like maybe this is just one person, maybe this is just a one-off, but because of that one fever already, it meant that the Falklands wasn't going to happen.
No fuimos recibidos por Malvinas, tuvimos que seguir nuestra ruta incierta, no teníamos un destino claro.
What happens now is that we change to plan C when we start heading off to Montevideo. So that's when we start getting more rolling fevers.
March 23, 3 patients with fever. March 24, 5 patients with fever. In the moment that we did reach Uruguay, we had minimum 10 people with fever.
Their new destination, Plan C, was Montevideo, the capital of Uruguay and the closest major port. But at a time when cruise ships were being turned away from ports around the world, no one was sure what kind of welcome they would receive there.
I was now wondering if we would be allowed to disembark with people with a temperature.
As head doctor, Mauricio Usme found himself responsible for the health of more than 200 people on a ship that probably had a deadly virus on board. But if he was expecting support from the ship's owners, he was disappointed.
I wish to make it clear to you that if you do not provide me with the information I require and follow my direction, you will never work for us again.
South African-born entrepreneur Glenn Hafer is also a registered doctor and was medical consultant to P&O Cruises for 15 years. Hafer bought a stake in Aurora when well-known mountaineer Greg Mortimer stepped back from the company he'd founded. We approached Glenn Hafer and Aurora for an interview, but they declined.
I cannot understand why this person sent me this email in this very rude tone and threatening me. I was very disappointed. I was feeling that maybe I have not the support, the support from the company.
Dr. Usme is one of the best doctors I've ever worked with. He was under enormous pressure. He was really the man in the middle. He was shouldering the entire responsibility and care of the ship.
As the ship sailed towards Uruguay, there was public outcry in Sydney over passengers who'd been allowed to disembark from the Ruby Princess less than a week earlier. 900 people would end up with COVID-19, and 28 people died as a result. Dr. Usme thought it was his duty to include as much detail as possible on the health declaration for the Uruguayan authorities. Dr. Usme said that those on board the Greg Mortimer had been quarantined and that COVID-19 needed to be ruled out. But Glenn Hafer was worried about whether they'd be allowed to disembark.
The risk we carry is public outcry and wharfside workers refusing to allow the ship to berth and allow passengers to disembark. Please bear in mind that how you write the health declaration will influence the way that this is viewed. We don't know we have COVID-19. We are taking precautions as if we do. Give limited information truthfully.
Hola, Capitán. Hola, señor.
In a recording made by Dr. Usme on the 23rd of March, the ship's captain said he didn't believe the ship was in quarantine.
The ship is not under quarantine. That is clear.
No, the ship is under quarantine.
No, it's not.
Yes.
No,
yes. And I told to the captain, I'm never going to change the health declaration because the health declaration for Uruguay is showing the real situation on board.
He's a very moral person. He's got a very profound, unshakable moral integrity. And he kind of is almost a bit old school that he works out of medicine as a calling, as a vocation, rather than a job. And that became clear as I worked with him.
I was very confused. In this moment, my feeling was I'm alone. Nobody is helping me here.
Aurora Expeditions disagrees with Dr. Usme. In response, they said the highly selective leaking of communications may serve the frustrations and agendas of individual parties, but does not reflect the facts.
So what happens as you approach Uruguay? Are you able to dock in Montevideo?
No, not at all. And in fact, the whole of the Rio de la Plata was full of ships in our situation. We were basically moored 20k off of Montevideo.
So far, everyone who was sick only had mild symptoms. But Dr. Green was afraid of what would happen if that changed and they needed access to a hospital.
At that stage, I was doing the maths. If it was COVID and we had a population of 200 people, that could mean 20 to 40 people getting really sick.
Given what was happening in hospitals in northern Italy at the time, you must have dreaded that possibility.
Absolutely. I'd already kind of followed and heard from doctors and nurses working in that situation. It was like a war zone, and I kind of at that stage didn't know if that wasn't going to be reproduced in our situation.
Soon enough, the doctors were confronted with their first seriously ill patient, Sydney physiotherapist Carl Scher. A photo records the moment that Dr. Usme calls for help from the bridge.
It was our test case. Basically, we approached the hospitals in Uruguay and Montevideo, and then luckily the British hospital accepted this patient, and within hours we were getting a Coast Guard out and the famous transfer of our first patient occurred.
Carl Schur was taken to the British hospital and intubated.
Then at 1 o'clock in the morning, I get a kind of repeated, relentless knocking at my door, and I get out of bed, and I got a message from the captain via a crew member that I had to go and see Maurizio. So I went and saw him, and he was spiking a horrendous fever.
I remember I have a lot of body pain, discomfort. Immediately I know that I have coronavirus also. And I was in my cabin in isolation immediately. That means Dr. Jess was the doctor now with the responsibilities on board.
Yeah, I feel this huge weight now has landed on my shoulders. Not only am I last man standing, but also it's clear that it's COVID. So I just really, you know, I mean, that's like darkest hour stuff, really.
The Greg Mortimer cruise ship was anchored off the coast of Uruguay, with 217 passengers and crew on board, many of them Australian. Some had symptoms of COVID-19. Around the same time the first passenger was being evacuated from the ship, cabin maid Angela Gavilan also received bad news.
Pero cuando él me dijo que yo tenía fiebre, fue un golpe muy fuerte. Ese mismo día me empecé a sentir mal, empecé a sentir mucho dolor de cabeza. Al día siguiente sentía mucho dolor en mi cuerpo, no me quería parar de mi cama, mi compañera tenía mucha fiebre y era un enfermo cuidando a otro porque me preocupaba muchísimo ella porque su fiebre no bajaba.
The passengers and crew both faced the same threat, but they weren't really in it together.
It's a thing of beauty, isn't it?
Passengers could stave off cabin fever with exercise and imagination.
Okay, he thinks he's going to get it, but it's not low on bowls, Danny, remember that.
Oh.
Life was different downstairs.
Mi compañera estaba en la cama de abajo y yo estaba en la cama de arriba. Son espacios muy reducidos, son espacios sin luz natural. Los camarotes de los pasajeros, por supuesto que son muy lujosos, amplios, con balcón, con mucha luz. Para el crew es normal siempre los cuartos estar bajo la línea de agua, o sea, era muy difícil estar ahí adentro porque nunca sabíamos qué pasaba, si era de día o de noche.
Tell me what happened when Rose got sick.
Yeah, it was just another day in our confined cabin, and Rose had developed this slightly irritating cough that wouldn't go away. I thought that I ought to let Jeff Green know.
The doctor?
Yeah. He examined Rose, listened to her chest, and was sufficiently worried to put her on some oxygen.
Because she had some of those comorbidity things, we were still looking at people of risk, and she was older, and it just meant that things could go pear-shaped more quickly. The next morning I went in to follow up, and there were more signs of concern. And at that stage I really felt more than anyone she needed to be evacuated.
They came down and dressed her in full PPE stuff as well. And she was on oxygen, an oxygen mask, at that stage, which helped her cough, and I was reassured by that. And so they got a wheelchair and popped her in the wheelchair, and that's the last I saw of her. She just disappeared.
Rose Paget was the second passenger evacuated from the Greg Mortimer. She was also taken to the British hospital in Montevideo. A few days later, Graham got a phone call to say she'd been intubated. It was just the beginning of the bad news he would receive from the hospital.
I still look back on that with dread, because I can distinctly remember thinking to myself, what the hell do I do in this country where I don't speak a word of Spanish, and I get a message from ICU that, sorry, we'd done our best, but it didn't work and she's passed away.
If Graham was going to see Rose before it was too late, he'd need a helping hand from Uruguay.
I am Dr. Karina Rando. I am the General Director of Coordination of the Ministry of Health. We could not continue going one by one to pick up every sick patient. We started to be worried because the boat was big. There was a lot of people on board. We need to do something bigger. We arranged that we were going to go to the boat and check every patient and decide what to do after that.
Watching people come on board, the doctors in full PPE, made me realise the actual severity of our situation. It was actually quite shocking and quite spooky. It was like, oh my goodness, and this is us. They really believe we are infected.
All the passengers and crew were tested for coronavirus. When the results came back, they took everyone by surprise.
They said that at the moment there was 60% positive on the boat. So this was like out of the ballpark. I mean, I thought that maybe like 20%. So you're on this ship and you realise that you're in a kind of COVID incubator, that you're actually on a floating petri dish, really.
What did you think when you got the test results back?
Well, we think, Houston, we have a problem.
Infection continued to spread on the Greg Mortimer long after passengers were isolated in their rooms. The most likely cause was contaminated surfaces. But passengers were at least able to relax in comfort and got regular updates via announcements over the ship's loudspeaker. Sick crew, like housekeeper Angela Gavilan, were in cramped rooms below deck.
Era muy difícil estar ahí adentro porque nunca sabíamos qué pasaba, si era de día o de noche. Esos anuncios no se escuchaban en nuestros cuartos, entonces no sabíamos exactamente lo que estaba pasando.
As crew morale sank, Filipino storekeeper Ronnie Lorenzo reached out to his friends in isolation.
Era muy querido por toda la tripulación, por todo el mundo, porque él era como un papá. Para mí fue una persona, fue una amistad grande en ese momento que yo fui aislada personalmente. Todo el tiempo nos llamaba, estaba pendiente. Me avisó ese día en la mañana que lo habían aislado. Entonces estaba preocupado.
Ronnie's condition soon worsened, worrying his friends and his family at home in the Philippines. Both of the ship's doctors, Colombian Mauricio Usme and Kiwi Jeff Green, were also sick.
I wasn't surprised I was positive, but what it did change was that I was now no longer able to go out and see people. I was actually a source of infection. I wasn't a source of help anymore.
New doctors from Uruguay had taken over the care of the passengers and crew on the ship.
Are you telling your wife, your children, what is happening at this time?
In the moment that I was with shortness of breath, was very difficult. You know why? Because maybe the possible complication and die in an intensive care unit, maybe no more opportunities to talk with my family, was necessary for me tell them about my situation. My family was very worried.
Behind the scenes, Aurora Expeditions and the Australian government had been trying to find a solution. Uruguay agreed to act.
We have to do something. These people cannot stay in that boat for longer. There was a huge cooperation between Uruguay and Australian governments.
Mañana llegará el vuelo humanitario para repatriar a los pasajeros de esa ciudadanía y de Nueva Zelanda.
This was the news that passengers had been so eager to hear. Uruguay would let them disembark in order to catch a charter flight home.
On Good Friday, on the evening, you heard the anchor being pulled up, and this amazing moment that we started sailing into Montevideo. So I didn't know what was going to happen, and there were stories from other countries in South America where, as people pulled in, there were actually protesters, lining the dock.
We prepare the buses, we separate the drivers from the people. We were very clear that they couldn't have all their luggage with them because we would not be able to be helping them with the luggage.
We're watching the buses all line up and there were an awful lot of ambulances. And I was a bit perplexed, I have to say, as to why. As I look out to my right, I'm very close to the gangway. A person in a wheelchair in full protective armour, looks like a human mummy, seated in this wheelchair is there. And I thought, oh my God, what's going on here? What is really happening? I didn't work out who it was until we actually got into quarantine in Melbourne.
Who was it?
It was my friend, Dr. Mauricio Usme.
Ronnie Lorenzo and myself, we were disembarked. First ambulance was for me and second ambulance was for him because Ronnie got inflammation like a pneumonia also.
Dr. Usme, who'd led the efforts to protect everyone on board, was hospitalised, along with storekeeper Ronnie Lorenzo. Both were fighting for their lives. Meanwhile, the Australians and New Zealanders were escorted to the airport along a so-called sanitary corridor to prevent the spread of any infection in Uruguay.
And then slowly this entire cavalcade, which was about 1 kilometre long, moved out of the protection of the dock, and we started driving through the streets of Montevideo. And then people started saying, they're cheering.
And the people of Montevideo were lined up on the streets, waving, banners, little children, blowing kisses to people they'd never met before. We're sort of like, in the worst possible way, celebrities for all the wrong reasons. But you couldn't help but feel the care, compassion and concern by people we've never met for what we had gone through. I think it touched everybody on the ship. A lot of passengers didn't even know about Uruguay or Montevideo, and when they had said that that's where we were going, people had asked, where is it? Well, now it's on their bucket list of places they want to go to thank these people.
When there is a crisis, there shouldn't be frontiers. So I think that Uruguay did what we should do. It's nothing marvelous. It's just what people should do when something like this happens.
Just being a good citizen.
It's what we would like to do if we were in the boat. We would like somebody to take care of us.
On the plane, it was clear that they'd also set it up as a hospital because there were some people who could have easily gone downhill very quickly. It was the weirdest flight of my life.
Touchdown in Australia after a long international ordeal.
When we finally landed in Melbourne, there are helicopters hovering over from TV stations and, you know, we'd sort of become a news item.
With a fleet of ambulances and buses greeting them, more than 100 passengers from the Greg Mortimer cruise ship are at last back home.
Yeah, felt good to be home.
Their fellow passengers had left, but Australians Rose Paget and Carl Scher were in the ICU at the British Hospital in Montevideo. Their partners, who'd tested positive for COVID, were also at the hospital in isolation.
Rose could have been a million miles away for all the contact I could have with her. I was sort of stuck in this room. I had a lovely window and I could see outside into the gardens and watch the birds.
You just must have felt so isolated.
Oh, totally, yes.
Graham was told Rose had been placed in a coma and intubated. Then that her kidneys had failed, and shortly after, that she had a significant gastrointestinal bleed.
What was the worst time for you in the hospital?
I find it hard to talk about, but one Sunday morning, the doctor who had come in each day to give me Rose's progress came in and got me to deck up in full PPE and put me in a wheelchair and took me through to ICU. And I thought that was the end.
Is that why they took you to see her then,
Yes.
do you think?
Yeah, I'm quite sure that they felt that I was owed that, to be able to see her before I saw her in the undertaker's parlour in a box. And I couldn't say goodbye because there was a bloody window there and I couldn't touch her. I couldn't.
Most of the passengers had gone home. But for the ship's crew, the nightmare was far from over.
Remember that the passengers be disembarked April 10, but all the crew members still on board, and nobody told us nothing, and no intention for disembark.
Yo me sentía mal físicamente, me sentía mal de ánimo, no podía dormir.
Angela didn't even know that her friend, Ronnie Lorenzo, had been taken to hospital.
De repente, un día no me llamó, pero al siguiente día yo lo llamé y no me contestó.
At home in the Philippines, Ronnie's anxious wife, Nena, spoke to her husband in hospital.
Saturday na siya tumawag, nasa ospital na siya, meron na siyang mask na Then, tinanggal niya yon para lang makausap kami. Kausap niya lahat. Huwag mag-alala, sabi niya, pero tingin ko nahihirapan na siya ron eh. After that, hindi na, wala na kaming video call.
The intensive care unit, his bed was close to my bed. I can see him for the window, and I told him, Ronnie, don't worry, like, everything is gonna be fine.
Dr. Mauricio Usme got a hero's send-off when he was discharged from hospital. He went straight back to the Greg Mortimer. Ronnie wasn't with him.
Pagdating na April 17, yun na yung hindi magandang balita. Hindi daw nakayanan ni Ronnie.
The announcement from the Capitan by the speakers was maybe 3:30 p.m. Was disaster. Nobody talked about, maybe in 30 minutes, people was crying.
Y fue un golpe muy duro. Fue en ese momento que el capitán lo anunció. Lógicamente para mí fue muy duro porque era un amigo muy cercano y fue muy fuerte. Yo hasta el día de hoy, siempre cuando recuerdo esto, siempre lloro.
"52-year-old Ronnie Lorenzo had been on the Greg Mortimer since its maiden voyage last year. Like so many of the crew, his widow always thought their last trip was too risky.
Ano yun yung sinabi ko sa kanya, bakit nagbabiyahe pa? Uso na nga yung may pandemic na nga. Sabi niya wala na rin akong dahil lahat naman kami sumusunod lang naman sa kagustuhan ng Yun talaga yung sinasabi ko sa kanya, dapat hindi na nagbiyahe.
In the moment that Ronnie died was the break point. People was very sad. People was disappointed from the company. And also people was feeling that the next person with complication is everyone, people was feeling that Ronnie today died, but maybe tomorrow I'm gonna die also,
Con la muerte de Ronnie se desataron muchas inconformidades, se desataron muchos sentimientos de rabia. Los pasajeros se fueron a sus casas en avión privado y nosotros como crew seguíamos encerrados, seguíamos infectados y no pasaba nada.
Members of the crew also say they were given food that had expired and their access to the internet was restricted. They were now more desperate than ever to get off the ship. But Cruise Management International, a Miami-based company responsible for the crew and the ship's operation, wanted them to sail to the Canary Islands when they were COVID-free. With infection still spreading on board, the crew were fearful of a second ill-fated voyage.
Así como Ronnie había muerto, cualquier persona podría empeorarse durante el viaje y podría morir. Nosotros pedíamos que fuéramos repatriados a cada uno de nuestros países. Habían muchos compañeros que estaban tratando de hacer como una revolución. Se hablaba de muchas cosas en el barco. Se hablaba de personas que querían quemar el barco. Se hablaba de personas que querían prender las señales de alarma, que son los fuegos, para llamar la atención de los otros barcos y de la ciudad, los pirotécnicos.
¿Imaginas estar en esa situación, lejos de tu casa, lejos de tu familia, con problemas de comunicación? Bueno.
In the end, some of the crew decided to go public with their complaints.
Conversamos con Carolina y esta es parte de su testimonio.
¿Cuánto más tenemos que esperar para que tomen acciones? Por favor, sáquennos de acá.
People, very clear, they told, we want jump from the ship. I'm feeling that I'm gonna die on board.
Eventually, with support from the public and sympathetic trade unions, the crew's prayers were answered. A month after the passengers had gone home, Uruguay agreed to let the crew disembark.
Se llegó el día de la despedida del Greg Mortimer, aquí con mi traje de seguridad, listos para partir a un hotel, hacer la cuarentena en el hotel, esperando negativizar para poder irnos a casa.
In the moment that we had the confirmation, official confirmation, everyone was very happy. The stress was immediately cooled down. People was happy, calling the families. Everybody was feeling that we are safe, you know? We are safe. We are safe because ashore is different than if you are alone in the ocean, you know?
With so many international borders closed, it would be many weeks before everyone was finally repatriated. We approached Cruise Management International for comment, but they turned down repeated interview requests. The Greg Mortimer set sail for the Canary Islands with a skeleton crew, where it awaits its next cruise in 2021. But more than 2 months after setting off on the holiday of a lifetime, 4 Australian passengers were still in hospital, far from home. The last Australian passengers from the Greg Mortimer were still recovering from COVID-19 in Uruguay. Sydney physiotherapist Carl Scher spent 3 weeks in ICU, but it was another 6 weeks before he was well enough to return home. Rose Paget eventually stepped back from the brink of death and slowly emerged from her long coma. In total, Graham and Rose spent almost 3 months in the British hospital.
It was a very, very gradual process. When I first was allowed round to see her in her ICU room, I had to gown and glove and mask and everything. And she was basically comatose. If I spoke her name, she could just open her eyes and obviously recognised me with a bit of a smile. There was a big send-off from ICU. The whole staff gathering around Rose's stretcher, wishing us Godspeed.
When her condition had stabilised enough for her to travel, her insurer provided a medically equipped private jet for the journey home.
Can you see it?
What was it like when you touched down?
Totally overwhelming. I remember I could see out of my window Fremantle Port with boats coming in and out. For me, was emotionally overwhelming. I was able to shed tears on the tarmac of Perth Airport.
Hello, Rose.
Hi.
Hi, Amos. Good to see you.
After a 6-month ordeal, she's alive and, if not well, then at least improving.
Turn around here.
Rose is dealing with the long-term effects of COVID-19 and is still piecing together what happened to her in Uruguay.
I remember arriving in a little foyer at the front of the hospital, going inside, and I don't remember much after that, to be perfectly honest. And I've had to rely on Graham, my husband, so much, because he's my memory card. I still sometimes feel as if I'm in a dream or a nightmare, you know, sometimes. But certainly the worst is behind me, I'm sure.
Walk up to the bars and the cones.
A couple of weeks ago, when she was starting her ability to stand up, I was able to give her a hug. That was overwhelming as well, because this was the first time since we'd been on the boat that I'd been able to give her a hug. And I started crying then too.
Several passengers and crew are still dealing with the lingering effects of COVID-19. Rose's doctors don't yet know whether there's been any long-term damage to her kidneys.
How do you feel looking back on the decision to go ahead with the cruise?
A lot of my colleagues from Denmark were very angry at that decision. I am still grateful for the opportunity, even though it was curtailed. But for Rose, I think she will deserve some compensation. How that will come about, I don't know yet. We haven't decided.
Aurora Expeditions has offered passengers a 2/3 refund or a ticket on any other cruise. Some have already signed up for a special trip next year, which will embark from Montevideo. But Anthony Phillip doesn't feel ready to face another cruise.
You know, I got on healthy and I left retrospectively very damaged. I felt my holiday, my selfish desire as I rationalised it, has now cost a gentleman his life. This is a gentleman in his early 50s with a family. How did this go so horribly wrong? I can only say that they put profits before people. It was a money-making decision.
Angela Gavilan says she's also been scarred by her experience.
Estoy tomando antidepresivos y medicinas para dormir, pero fue muy fuerte y más fuerte de pronto perder a una persona y que fue nuestro compañero es lo más fuerte de esto y que de verdad se hubiera podido evitar si se hubiera pensado un poco más sobre las vidas humanas por encima del dinero. Entonces es la primera vez que hablo con alguien de esto.
In a statement, Aurora Expeditions told Dateline,
"The decision to set sail was made following wide consultation and based on the information available to us at the time. Our number one priority has always been the health and well-being of our passengers, staff and crew."
Ronnie Lorenzo became a grandfather while he was working on the Greg Mortimer.
Lalo na ngayon na yung apo niya hindi niya na nakikita. Hanggang video ko lang sila. Maraming pangarap na hindi natupad.
Ronnie was the breadwinner for his extended family. He was supporting a brother with leukemia and a son with special needs. But what his family really misses is his kindness.
Pag nasa biyahe siya, pag may makita siyang bagay sa'yo, mga bagay-bagay na maganda, si Ronnie, tatawagan ka agad na, "Ma, may pabango dito, napakabango, bagay sa'yo." Sa mga bata, spoiled ako sa kanya. Mas uunahin niya pa yung sarili niya kaysa sa amin. Ayun yung mga bagay na namimiss ko sa kanya.
Back home in Colombia, where the pandemic has killed more than 27,000 people, Dr. Mauricio Usme is putting his experience on the Greg Mortimer to good use.
Hello, Amos. How are you doing, my friend?
Working in a hospital ICU for COVID patients in Medellin, Dr. Usme seems strangely energized by his ordeal.
I always tell to my patient, my friend, I was in the bed like you. I can feel that you are feeling. Don't worry, you're gonna be fine. un paciente que por la gracia de Dios. I'm so happy. I'm so happy because God gave me the opportunity to feel in my body, in my mind, in my soul, what's mean to be a patient with COVID. And now I can to pay back to the life, the opportunity. I'm so happy to working in this unit. I'm so happy.